Welcome back to History 1122, second half of Western Civ. We're going to tackle one of the biggest topics of the semester, the Second World War. I've taught this for years. I don't think I've ever taught it the same way twice. It's such an immensely complex topic. So this is how I'm going to go about it for this course. Here we're going to introduce it. Talk about context and significance. We're going to talk about the alliances that fight the war, where the war is fought. And then, in our second lecture, we're going to talk about the leadership groups of the great powers that participate in the war. This is truly a world war. Many nations are involved in it. We're going to restrict our coverage to eight of the great powers that are involved. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, the Soviet Union, and then of course Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. So we're going to talk about the leadership groups of these three great powers. Now, of these eight great powers. In some of these countries, I'm only going to talk about one or two people. This is a survey class. I know that we are, for the most part, not training historians. So we want to keep this at a level that's understandable and useful to you. So we'll try to keep it elevated and talk about the big things that have a lasting impact on the 20th century. After talking about the leadership groups of the great powers, we're going to talk about Hitler's diplomacy, how Europe sort of stumbled into war in 1939. And then we're going to talk about the beginning of the war in the Pacific with the Japanese, their encroachment on Manchuria, and then China, and then the decision to try to knock the United States out of the Pacific at Pearl Harbor. Then we're going to look at some of the decisive campaigns of the Second World War, both in the European and Pacific theaters. Then we will look at the Holocaust in some detail. And we'll talk about, at the end of that discussion, we'll talk about explanations that have been put forward by a variety of scholars to try to explain the Holocaust. And then we'll probably end the Second World War by talking about Hiroshima, the atomic bombings of Japanese cities in August of 1945. And I may spend a little bit of time talking about the two great conferences at the end of the war, Yalta in February of 45, with Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, and then Potsdam in July of 45. Here you have Stalin. And then Truman has taken FDR's place. President Roosevelt has died. And Winston Churchill has been voted out of office, and Clement Attlee will be the British Prime Minister at Potsdam. So we have a lot to do here. Let's start with an introduction. Context, World War II is so big, I would say it's its own context. Significances, well, Nazi Germany is defeated, and you can all be glad for that. Fascist Italy is defeated, Imperial Japan is defeated. The Soviet Union survives, and it was a very close-run thing. It looked as if that short-lived experiment in communism was going to end in 1941. And of course it does end in, 1991. Decolonization, I suppose, is one of the significances here. The Second World War is essentially going to put an end to the British Empire. And the British Empire represents imperialism, I suppose, at its height. And of course, the United States emerges as the world's dominant power as a result of the Second World War. Now, the two alliances, these so-called Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, the collaboration or the alliance between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy is sometimes called the Pack of Steel, and we'll talk about that when we talk about Hitler's diplomacy. So you have the Axis on one side, and their political and military actions are not coordinated. It's difficult to think of them really as allies at all. Certainly, the Italian alliance for Nazi Germany is not a strategic advantage, and we'll talk about that. For the Allies, of course, you have the United Kingdom and France, Soviet Union and China, and then, of course, the United States. And again, we're just dealing with these 8 great powers. There are many, many, many more countries we could discuss. Theaters of war, I'm going to sort of, bounce around the world when we talk about the Second World War. Historians and military people usually refer to the European theater of war. That's the war against Mussolini and Hitler. And then we refer to the Pacific theater of war, the war against Japan. And then, of course, the war takes place in North Africa as well. Sometimes that's referred to as the African theater, and sometimes it's simply lumped in with the European theater because it lies there on the southern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. One other category that I want to bring to your attention. Historians have categorized nations in the Second World War as either status quo nations or revisionist nations. Now, the revisionist nations are those countries who are willing to risk war to attain their national goals, to redraw the boundaries, to enlarge their state, to augment their power. And there are 3. The Nazis, Germany under Hitler is obviously a revisionist power. We know already that Hitler wants to destroy the Versailles Treaty and reverse the outcome of the First World War. Italy, under Mussolini, you get the sense that Mussolini fancies himself as a sort of latter-day Roman emperor, and he fancies Italy as being at the heart of this emerging new 20th century Roman Empire, a fantasy in Mussolini's head. And then, of course, the Japanese are obviously a revisionist power, quite willing to undertake aggression throughout East Asia along the Pacific Rim to satisfy their national ambitions. Status quo powers would rather leave things as they are. They're not seeking war. They're not seeking to redraw the boundaries of either Europe or the Pacific. Of course, these include the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and the Soviets. Now, the Soviets are a special case here, and this complicates things a little bit. The Soviets kind of have one foot in the revisionist camp and another foot in the status quo camp, and here's why. Stalin is not actively looking for war, but he is looking for opportunities to regain those territories lost as a result of the Great War and Versailles. Parts of what we think of as Finland, the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and other areas in Eastern Europe. Stalin would love to regain these territories for the Soviet Union. Again, he's not actively looking for war to do it, but he's looking for perhaps opportunities to do so. And indeed, opportunities will present themselves as we get closer to the war. So, I'm going to say one thing more in this introduction, and then we're going to launch into our discussion of the leadership groups of the Second World War. And that is this. I said in the beginning, this war is incredibly complex. We call it the Second World War or World War II, when in actuality it is many separate wars that are all sort of bundled up under this big label of World War II. There are distinct wars that begin and end that have no relation to other conflicts that are taking place across Eurasia. Again, the Japanese and the Germans do not coordinate their strategies at all. There's a German war against Poland, and the Russians participate in this, and then it ends. And then the Nazis overrun Western Europe. And then there's a German-British war that goes on until the end in 1945. There's a German war against the Soviet Union, the largest war of the Second World War. It runs from 41 to 45. There's, of course, the ongoing campaigns by the United States in the Pacific against the Japanese. Mussolini is going to launch his own little separate wars that become sort of part of this bigger thing that we call World War II. So this is a remarkably complex series of events. They're not necessarily connected, but they're all occurring simultaneously. So we call it the Second World War. So our next lecture, we'll look at the leadership groups of these countries. Thank you.